Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 1684.
Does the gentleman move to pass the bill as amended?
Yes, I do.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 1684, a bill to amend the Oil Pollution Act of 1990 and the Federal Water Pollution Control Act to impose penalties and provide for the recovery of removal costs and damages in connection with certain discharges of oil from foreign offshore units and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Florida, Mr. CURBELO, and the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. DeFAZIO, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on H.R. 1684.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself so much time as I may consume.
The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, following the Exxon Valdez disaster in Alaska in 1989, Congress passed the Oil Pollution Act of 1990, or OPA. The basic premise of OPA is that the party responsible for the spill is responsible for all the costs of cleaning up the mess. The Deepwater Horizon spill in 2010 reminded us of the impact a spill of its size can have on waters, coastlines, people, and our economy. It's important to note that these offshore facilities, as defined by OPA, are limited only to the navigable waters of the United States, and foreign rigs cannot be designated as responsible parties. Therefore, if there was an oil spill originating in foreign waters, the most the responsible party would have to pay to clean up American waters and shores is $150 million. This issue is of particular concern to Gulf states. Mexico, Cuba, and the Bahamas are actively looking at expanding their offshore drilling operations. Of particular concern is Mexico, which is looking into ultra-deep wells exceeding 6,000 feet in depth. In 2012, Mexico's top oil regulator said they were not prepared to handle a serious accident or major oil spill. But it's not just the Gulf states that could be negatively affected by a spill. On the Canadian side of Lake Erie, offshore energy exploration is being conducted for natural gas. While Canadian law prohibits oil extraction from the Great Lakes, the risk of a spill persists. Again, under current law, the responsible party would only have to pay a maximum of $150 million for cleanup. In response to these concerns, my friend from Florida, Representative Patrick Murphy, and I introduced the legislation that is being considered here today. The bill ensures that the responsible party, regardless of origin, pays for all American cleanup costs by applying OPA. This will also apply Clean Water Act penalties on responsible foreign parties. I'm proud that this legislation has broad bipartisan support and has been endorsed by environmental, fishing, and other groups that depend on the water for their livelihoods. Our coastal communities need peace of mind that if they are harmed by a foreign spill, resources are available to clean up their shores and help them recover. American taxpayers should not have to foot the bill to bail out the mistakes of foreign companies. I would like to thank and commend the Coast Guard and the majority and minority staffs of the committee, particularly John Rayfield and Dave Jansen, for their work on this important legislation. H.R. 1684 is a very straightforward bill that looks to hold the party responsible for an foreign oil spill that affects U.S. waters or lands accountable. I urge all members to support it, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Florida reserves. The gentleman from Oregon.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman from Oregon is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong support of this non-controversial legislation that will clarify existing federal authority regarding the liability for and enforcement of offshore oil spills originating from a foreign source outside the U.S. Exclusive Economic Zone. H.R. 1684, the Foreign Spill Protection Act of 2016, clarifies that owners and operators of oil production facilities located offshore and outside the United States are liable for cleanup costs and damages from oil spills. These foreign entities are responsible for oil spills that originate outside U.S. waters if they threaten or cause damage in the United States. Foreign entities would be subject to criminal and civil penalties, federal removal authority, and any state-authorized remedy currently allowed under federal and state law. I'd like to commend the cooperation shown by the Committee on Transportation Infrastructure, Chairman Schuster, Coast Guard Maritime Subcommittee Chairman Hunter, Ranking Member Garamendi, in working out the final details of this legislation. Mr. Speaker, the Deepwater Horizon disaster painfully reminded us of how catastrophic an offshore oil spill can be, both in its geographic reach and in its environmental and economic costs. The settled liability enforcement regimes authorized under the Oil Pollution Act and the Clean Water Act have proven themselves to be comprehensive, durable, and effective. In the event of a spill, this response regime has ensured time and time again the federal government has clear, unequivocal authority to respond to a spill, restore the environment and communities harmed, recover damages for the harm caused. This legislation will in no way impede or change those indispensable authorities. In closing, it is helpful enhancement to clarify that spills originating from foreign sources fall under this well-established legal regime. I ask members on both sides of the aisle to join me in supporting this legislation. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Oregon reserves. The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'd just like to thank the ranking member, Mr. DeFazio, for his statement and for his cooperation on this legislation. I also want to thank Chairman Schuster. As the gentleman mentioned, the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee is oftentimes an example of how we can put politics aside to work together and do good things for the American people. This legislation is very important to my constituents in South Florida, in the Florida Keys, and really to coastal communities all over the country. So I thank the gentleman for his statement. I thank everyone who had a part in crafting this legislation, and I urge all of my colleagues to support it. I reserve the balance of my time, and I'm prepared to close.
Well, I have one other speaker who's vitally interested and concerned about this legislation, the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Murphy.
Mr. Murphy is recognized.
I would yield him such time as he may consume.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the gentleman from Florida, thank the gentleman from Oregon for their tireless efforts to protect our environment. As a gentleman from Florida, and I know firsthand, so much of our economy is based on our environment. Making sure that we have clean water, clean air is exactly what we need to be focused on. So I urge my colleagues to support this bill. I believe that ensuring the party responsible for such oil spills are held liable for this. So hopefully we get nice bipartisan support going forward, and thank the two gentlemen for their work putting this forward. I would also like to rise today in support of H.R. 2901, the Flood Insurance Market Parity and Modernization Act. I was proud to put this bipartisan legislation forward with my good friend, another gentleman from Florida, Mr. Ross, to clarify that private flood insurance may be an available option for homeowners who satisfy mandatory coverage requirements under the National Flood Insurance Program. For Florida homeowners, this is a win-win, giving them more options for flood insurance coverage and using new competition to drive down prices and expand coverage options for consumers. The National Flood Insurance Program is an important tool that empowers and protects homeowners all across America. The Biggert Waters Act of 2012 took an important step in opening up the market and allowing private flood insurance policies to satisfy mandatory coverage requirements under the program. However, as we learned, sometimes even the best laid plans can have unintended consequences. With the lack of clarity as to which private flood insurance policies are allowed in the program, the market has not been able to expand, and consumers have been left with just one choice to insure their properties from flood risk: the National Flood Insurance Program. I recently heard from one of my constituents in Martin County, Florida, about how the premium for just 1 year of flood insurance coverage through the NFIP ended up being 5 times the price they expected it to be. To make matters worse, the maximum coverage was only half of what they paid for the home itself. Yet, they were required to purchase the higher price plan that did not provide the coverage they needed because there were no other options. That highlights this urgent need to allow competition in the flood insurance marketplace to meet homeowners' needs and drive down costs. But to do that, we must allow the states to license and regulate flood insurance policies exactly like homeowners insurance, car insurance, or health insurance. Yet, almost inexplicably, Florida's private flood insurance market remains restrained because homeowners are not given the choice to look to private market policies for more flood insurance options. The bank will not accept other policies because their regulations haven't approved them. This bill will solve this problem by allowing state insurance commissioners, who have long been considered by Congress as the most appropriate regulators of insurance, to certify private insurance plans to provide equivalent or better protections for flood insurance, other than the NFIP plan. Everyone I talk to agrees that Florida's insurance commissioner is certainly better equipped to regulate flood insurance in our state than the federal banking regulators. By breaking this down, we break down a major barrier to marketplace expansion. This legislation will foster more competition, greatly benefiting homeowners across Florida and the nation. I thank the gentleman from Texas, Chairman Hincherling, for his leadership on the issue. I also extend my deep gratitude to the gentlewoman from California, Ranking Member Waters, for her relentless advocacy for consumers and for working with us to improve this legislation and produce a solid bipartisan outcome. I appreciate all my colleagues on the Financial Services Committee for moving this common sense measure forward with unanimous bipartisan support. I'm hopeful that today it'll be passed by the full House with similar support and swiftly considered in the Senate. Mr. Speaker, I urge my colleagues to support H.R. 2901, the Flood Insurance Market Parity and Modernization Act. I yield the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Florida yields. Gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I just want to thank my colleague from Florida, Mr. Murphy, who I saw in the Everglades on Friday. We were celebrating another great victory for Floridians there. And here today, we are again celebrating that we have been able to get something done with the support of our colleagues on behalf of the people of our state. We decided early on in this Congress that we would work together to protect our coastal communities, and that's exactly what we're doing here today. With that, I reserve the balance of my time, and I'm prepared to close.
Gentleman from Florida reserves. Gentleman from Oregon.
I have no further speakers. I would yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Oregon yields back. Does the gentleman from Florida yield back the balance of his time?
Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 1684 as amended? Those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended. The bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table.